a bit more of a chilled out podcast that combines sort of history with modern topics, mainly rooted in the 20th century. I feel like recently I've been doing a lot more topical topics and, doing more debate style or making points and trying to defend them and trying to comment on modern politics and current affairs and things like that. That's not necessarily my comfort zone, although I am enjoying it. But I did want to kind of take a break from that kind of stuff and just do like a sort of more comfy, cozy episode where I just ramble on about one specific topic and give you a bunch of useless information from academic articles that I've read for about 40 minutes. So if that's what you wanted to hear today, if you're, relaxing or doing some work or driving somewhere, I am here to support you in that. So yeah, this is just going to be a very chilled out episode about China's urban development of all topics. I decided to do this topic because in the last episode, I spoke a little bit about urbanization as part of China's demographic problem when I was discussing sort of Peter Zeihan's views on that issue. But this episode is very non-political. I'm literally just going to be talking about the history of urban development in China and some of the issues that have come up and sort of how urbanization in China is different or unique to the rest of the world, essentially. So yeah, sit back and relax and let's get started. As always, in my style, although I'm mainly going to be talking about the 20th and 21st centuries, I thought it would be nice to talk about some context or background on how towns and cities first came about in China. Large towns and pre-modern cities have existed in China since around the Tang Dynasty, during which there are around 1,000 towns and cities and a total urban population of 8 million, which was at the time was around 10% of the country's total population. So for example, Nanjing, which throughout history has been the capital or at least one of the principal cities of China. So in 600 AD, it had around 280,000 households and over 1 million residents. And it's believed that this was the largest city in the world at the time. I think even by modern standards, that's still a really large city. So you can see that China is no stranger to having sort of these big urban conurbations. So in the next dynasty, the Song dynasty, towns and cities became more like what we would consider them to be today, where you had areas that were like mixed commercial and residential. Previously, people sort of lived in different quarters depending on their jobs, but that was sort of abolished and relaxed a little bit. And during this period, again, around 10% of the population are living in urban areas. This didn't really change much over the coming centuries, even during the Qing dynasty, when the proportion actually declined slightly. But still, in total numbers, by 1949, you have around 57 million people living in large towns and cities. So helpfully, somewhat for us, the CCP actually enacted a definition of a city around this time, which is a place where the total population exceeds 100,000, at least 70% of whom are non-agricultural people, or alternatively, a place which must be an important strategic centre for the region or for the country. A town is defined as a place that has 3,000 or more people, and at least 70% of whom are, again, non-agricultural workers. So by 1950, China's population has reached 500 million, and by 1982, it would hit 1 billion. And this also corresponds with a huge leap in the urban population during the first years of the PRC, when the total urban population went from 10% of the whole population in 1949 to almost 20% in 1960. One article divides China's urbanization process during the Mao and Deng Xiaoping eras into 5 different sort of time periods. So the first one is 1949 to 57, where the urbanization was driven by a shift from rural villages to towns, and where the urban population grew to around 100 million people. So that's a huge jump and almost 1/5 of the entire population at the time. From 1958 to 1960, you've got the Great Leap Forward, and again the urban population jumped up to 130 million, which as we now know was not driven by increased economic output, but rather the desire for more faster growth. From 1961 to 1966, you actually see a reverse in the trend, and we've sort of discussed this in the episodes on the Great Leap Forward, where we discussed that the urban population was actively decreased by the CCP, and the government sent around 30 million people away from the cities, bringing the urban population back down to 1950s levels. Between 1967 and 1976, you've got the Cultural Revolution, and the urban population continued to grow, but it grew much slower, especially during the sort of down to the countryside movement, where, again, large swathes of the youth population were forcibly removed to the countryside. And then from 1977 to 1988, after the death of Mao Zedong and during the period of the four modernizations, you see an uptick in the rate of both rural to urban migration and the development of urban areas. So the number of cities actually increases from 245 in 1982 to 434 in 1988. And the total urban population almost doubles, going from around 113 million to around 200 million. So by the time you hit the 1990s, over 90% of people who do live in urban areas are living in cities with populations of over 100,000 people. So the cities that you have, not only are there a lot of cities, but they're also really, really big. And there are also around 11,500 towns by this point as well. So I think something interesting about China's urban development is that the growth isn't very linear. It sort of jumps about during the Maoist era, and it quite accurately reflects the political ups and downs and the economic decision-making by the CCP. Now we know the statistical facts about China's urbanization. I think we should talk a little bit more about the style of urban development, because I think that's where the uniqueness of China's cities comes through and sort of shines, and where we can see the true reflection of sort of the CCP's own goals, first of all, and also just the way in which, I guess, China's social and economic growth has differed from, say, normative Western patterns that we might be used to. So when the CCP first took over power in 1949, the Chinese economy was in tatters, and many cities were left in ruins after years of civil war and the war with Japan. The CCP not only had the huge task of rebuilding cities, but also transforming them ideologically as well. So they had to get rid of all traces of Western influence that had spread during the 1920s and 30s, which was not easy. It involved expelling foreigners, closing down movie theatres, banning foreign-style clothing, and banishing religious leaders. Private businesses were eventually taken over by the government, a process that was completed by around 1955, and they will mainly turn into state-owned enterprises, and sort of food prices, wages, benefits for workers were all brought into a standard alignment. Ideological education became the norm in schools and in the workplace, and new residence committees were formed to make sure that people adhered strictly to the policies of the new regime. So this meant more government interference in everyday life, more so than many people had been used to in the 20s and 30s, living a sort of bourgeois lifestyle in Shanghai or something like that. But for the majority of people, this actually meant an increase in living standards and in opportunities, especially again in places like Shanghai, where you see lots of slums and sort of shanty towns had been built up with the sort of semi-urbanization and semi-industrialization that you'd had at the beginning of the 20th century. So every single aspect of the way that cities developed during the Maoist era was very tightly controlled. As one article puts it, a pre-reform city was divided in an orderly way into functional zones, distinct areas of production, commerce, or transport, with housing and service facilities located nearby. Pollution, traffic congestion, crime, and other symptoms of overcrowding were at relatively tolerable levels. Most importantly, the urban residents regularly employed by state enterprises had been guaranteed not only stable employment and modest wages, but pensions, food, housing, and health benefits. So this was obviously a reflection of the kind of socialist ideals of the state, but it also reflected very early on the CCP's and also Mao's emphasis on industrialization and also their preferential treatment of urban workers. This was actually something Mao had hoped to avoid at first, but it just ended up happening anyway. As we know, for example, when we studied the Great Leap Forward, peasants in the countryside during the Maoist era were basically left to rely on their own devices. They had to use whatever resources they already had at their disposal. There was little to no investment in agricultural mechanization. And in fact, the government regularly introduced policies that could be considered harmful, such as large-scale infrastructure projects that reduced the efficiency of rural laborers, or the communization of villages and small towns that basically ruined how the peasants were able to work. The preferential treatment also showed in the way resources were allocated. So, for example, the majority of food was obviously grown by peasants, but the majority of it was also sent to cities to feed urban workers. This also took place during the Great Leap Forward period as well, in the late 1950s and during 1961. So a lot of people at the time noted that the colour of cities changed during this period. Martin White writes that the standardization and bureaucratization of commerce gradually eliminated the myriad trades and traders that had always provided colour to the streets and back alleys. Roving peddlers, pot menders, letter writers, seal carvers, trinket sellers, and so forth. With the state taking over the responsibility for providing for the needs of urbanites, it was no longer necessary to beckon customers with colourful signs and distinctive whistles or cries. So you see that kind of, I guess, randomness that you often get in large cities, whether that be good or bad, the tinges and the shades of different colours that you get when you go to any major city is kind of erased by the standardization that's brought with the communist regime. But a lot of people actually felt that this was a small price to pay for basically safe streets and a stable currency, which is not something that the Chinese people had the luxury of enjoying for basically all of the 20th century. And also, it was a distinctly Chinese development as well. Major cities in China, especially coastal cities, have been dominated by foreigners and foreign businesses in the 19th and 20th centuries. So for many people, they were happy to just basically see China back in Chinese-controlled hands and the development of these cities taking place by Chinese leaders. Having said that, the CCP did obviously rely a lot on Soviet experts to help them design pretty much every aspect of the new cities that they were going to build. This isn't really surprising because, as we discussed in previous episodes, the Soviet Union helped China heavily during this period, whether it came to industrialization or art and cultural projects. The Soviet Union had their hand in basically everything that China did in the early 1950s. So when it came to designing cities, they helped them plan it in a kind of very stereotypical Soviet style, I would say. So you've got like the grid-based street system where the whole city is kind of like designed around like this big central square. If you've ever been to a former Soviet state or a former communist country or a current communist country, somewhere like Cuba, that's a really like common communist design feature that you'll see. It's very interesting to see that it always kind of shows up, you know, and you have the big portraits of the leader in the center or like a statue or a monument or something like that. And then you have very specific designation of spaces, so very highly planned sort of public areas, factories, residential buildings. These are all very carefully delineated. After the Sino-Soviet split and during the Cultural Revolution, a lot of the city planning was halted. And as I said, the urban population grew more slowly as well. So till this day, really, if you go to China, a lot of the older cities that were developed during the Maoist era, basically, I would say most of them, unless the city was developed any time after like 1980, I'd say the majority of cities do have that very Soviet feel to them. I used to live in Dalian and it was very much like that. I don't know, very little quirkiness or like, I don't know, even like hiding places, so to speak, or like there was nothing unobvious or unruly about it. Like when you go to Beijing, you can still go and see like the hutongs. There are still ancient cultural monuments there for you to see. Same if you go to somewhere like Xi'an as well. But a lot of the cities that were built deliberately during the communist period don't have any of that sort of unique feel to them at all. So a lot of the urban planning principles that were developed during the Maoist era were driven by socialist ideological goals. So they're actually quite an interesting read. So, for example, the three main principles were that urban planning should assist in educating the new socialist man and fostering a strong community spirit. Urban planning should convey the principle of uniformity, and urban planning, especially neighborhood or district planning, should promote the principle of self-reliance or self-containment. So you can see that the aims of creating cities during this period is very socially oriented. The idea was to build a strong community, you know, mainly through these neighborhood committees whose jobs were to sort of reduce alienation and develop a strong socialist spirit by getting everyone living in that standardized housing so that there were no class differences and all the workers lived within their community in a contained area. And these areas tended to have everything that you needed, like shops and theaters and recreational areas, restaurants, hotels, hospitals, schools, etc. So in this period, cities were just as much like a social experiment as they were an administrative, political, or economic unit. They weren't actually created using economic norms because economics did not have a role in urban planning during this period. It was a social construct, if you will, and yet it was still supposed to serve this ultimate economic purpose of that fast-paced industrialization. Essentially, what the CCP wanted to do was create almost like a psychological space whereby they could foster this ideological commitment to the community and the regime that provides them with their relatively comfortable lifestyles, and through that means sort of extract people's labor and extract people's devotion, thereby grow the economy faster. So that was kind of the idea behind cities during the Maoist era. So in the post-Mao era, you have several changes that are made that change not only the pace of urbanization, but also the style of city living. So prior to the 1980s, any sort of urban development, including which areas were going to be designated to become urban areas, any sort of urban planning, housing, offices, factory construction, facilities, that was all controlled in a very top-down manner by the party. Urbanization was not linked to industrialization directly, in that land use or land sort of designation wasn't like an economic factor. In fact, as we know from our studies again of the Great Leap Forward, the CCP actually hoped to achieve industrialization despite lack of urbanization. So, for example, by creating these communes that did sort of their own mini industrializations internally, so you don't have to create cities where people sort of flock to them, and then you've got that drain of labor away from rural areas. Because of this lack of market impact on the rate of urban development, you have a very deflated growth of towns and cities throughout the 50s, 60s, and 70s. But after this period, so from the 80s onwards, the principles of urban planning sort of changed from socialist, community-oriented goals to sort of rational, goal-oriented principles that allowed for the market influence and for sort of competitiveness and hierarchies to form among different cities and regions. So the central government adopted the idea that urban planning should both serve the immediate needs of urban industrial and residential development, but in general should also be geared towards long-term development, say for about 20 years. So actually taking into the idea that cities will grow and change and may need to encompass more people and more businesses. They also introduced the idea that cities and towns and regions should be planned so that they actually complement one another and so that they can easily interlink with each other. So if one region has something that another doesn't, it's easy for the urban hubs to transport goods between them. And also you have the introduction of the idea of comfort and style, which took precedence over industrial output for the first time. So not only did they want to develop modern cities, but also sort of preserve that kind of traditional Chinese cultural elements, like different monuments, like I said, like with the hutongs in Beijing, sort of preserving those and turning them into desirable areas or tourist locations. So it became sort of like a more holistic approach to urban planning rather than just a very functional Soviet-esque design. Some of the definitions of what it was to be an urban area also changed. So in 1984, the definition of a city was changed so that it was a place of at least 60,000 people would qualify as long as its annual GDP reached 200 million yuan, or around 20 million US dollars. This showed a shift in the government's focus from pure numbers to other factors like what's the region's economic potential, how decentralized is the government, and how autonomous are they. So from a local government perspective, this meant that officials could designate more of the population as urban dwellers as well, without the people actually having to move from rural areas to technical urban areas. People obviously wanted to migrate from rural areas to urban areas for better job opportunities and economic opportunities, so they could get this new designation of being an urban person without actually having to go to an urban centre, but that didn't mean that they lived in an urban centre. And so lots of historians have characterized this period as sort of like the ruralization of urban areas, because lots of people just sort of slapped an urban label on what was basically still just a basic village. I would say the main driver of urbanization during this period was the formation of special economic zones, or SEZs. I think, will I use SEZs throughout? I'm not sure, because I don't know if that's a little bit hard to say, but we'll see. But anyway, from 1979 onwards, these areas were developed as part of the Reform and Opening Up program under Deng Xiaoping. So they were a sign of the CCP's move towards a more market-oriented economy, but again, very cautiously, because it was only very specific places. and they would allow foreign direct investment, international trade, and more liberal policies for private companies. And again, this was also a reflection of the CCP's inherent regionalism and preference for certain areas over others. So the first SEZs were Shenzhen, Zhuhai, and Shantou, all of which are in Guangdong, and Xiamen, which is in Fujian province. So these are all southern coastal cities, which, according to one author, are geographical areas selected because they were separated from the political power of Beijing and would experience less interference. These areas of China also had a history of contact with the outside world and were strategically located near Hong Kong. With the development of SEZs also came the development of land as an economic asset, as opposed to something that was just totally controlled by the state. But it was still slow and steady. There wasn't like a huge rush all of a sudden by all these property developers or industrial development companies. So according to Jieming Zhu, the introduction of non-state participation into land and property development was conducted with great caution. The first initiative was only to encourage tenants' self-development of their own premises and on-site infrastructure. Then, joint development of property by public-private partnership was put on trial after the clearance of legal barriers. Only at the end of the 1980s did the path become wider, so that private companies could play a greater role in facilitating urban development after more legal hurdles had been cleared. So this was even the case for industrial buildings. So in 1990, for example, around 50% of all buildings and warehouses in Shenzhen were developed by people who owned them, owner-occupiers. It was very difficult for new companies to sort of come in, buy land, build a factory, and then sell it out or lease it to other businesses. This created a very huge inefficiency in economic development. Again, over the course of the 80s, these laws were changed so that private companies could come in and buy land. So something new I learned about SEZs doing this research is that they were actually supposed to have a trickle-down effect on the surrounding regions and potentially even the rest of the country. So having more foreign direct investment in Shenzhen would also lead to more FDI in other surrounding areas. I always thought they were supposed to be very, very contained, but that's because that's what actually happened, not because that was the intention of the state necessarily. Special economic zones have actually led to huge regional disparities, especially with inland regions. Inland regions tend to still be quite reliant on state-owned enterprises that don't really get any foreign direct investment, whereas coastal areas obviously benefit from huge amounts of foreign investment and trade, as well as the ability to construct more modern infrastructure. The government has tried to do something about this. They had their Western Development Strategy, which was basically to try and develop the infrastructure, transport networks, build hydroelectric power plants, and basically support the raw industrial sector, so mining, agricultural processing, enhancing internal tourism, things like that, to bring the western and inland parts of China up to the same standards as the coastal regions. It kind of reminds me of the Third Front policy that we discussed in an episode quite a while ago now, where Mao sort of tried to develop essentially a final line of defense in case of foreign invasion by a foreign power. I think it was during the 60s mainly, but yeah, similarly to that project, this project didn't really work out. Government intervention, as we know, is very inefficient compared to the free market, even though the free market leads to inequalities and inequities. And this is further aggravated by the fact that obviously these regions are not only getting investment from China and Chinese consumers and the Chinese government, they're also getting foreign investment as well. So they're doubly well off, if that makes sense. So this political favouring of areas that contribute more to China's GDP growth is a very serious driver of the regional disparities that we see in China today. So according to Albrecht et al., in 1985, China established a number of economic policies that favoured urban areas. As such, the government began to provide urban price subsidies, including subsidising large unprofitable state-owned enterprises in urban areas. They also provided favourable credit allocations for urban areas that led to income redistribution. Because provinces with higher GDP tend to have greater urbanisation, these policies favoured coastal areas and increased regional inequality. So in China, we not only have an urban-rural divide, which I'm sure many people are already familiar with, but you also have an urban-urban divide, whereby coastal, eastern and southern cities are more desirable, more developed places to live than those in the interior, the west, and increasingly the northern parts of the country. While the Maoist era, it was sort of a policy to try and get everyone to the same level. This definitely evaporated after 1979, and it became way more like a fend for yourself, do what you can sort of model. And over time, this has led to the emergence of a very unique feature of Chinese urban life, in which cities fall into this sort of unofficial tier system, which is based on their desirability. So I don't know if this is actually a feature in any other society, and if you do know, please let me know, because I'm actually quite interested to know. But China's very unofficial tier system is something that's used, and sort of I feel like everyone kind of has like a very colloquial knowledge about this, especially if you're interested in like living or traveling, studying, whatever in China. So there's no list of the tier system of Chinese cities that's published by like the government or anything like that. But it is used by businesses, job seekers, immigrants, internally and externally, for people who want to know like where's desirable, what's like kicking off or whatever. So it's actually used quite a lot by businesses so that they can come up with sort of segmented marketing strategies based on a city's tier. So the information that's contained in the city rankings can tell you a lot, for example, about consumer behavior, about the demographics of an urban area, how much disposable income people might have, what they tend to spend on, etc., etc. So there are around 600 cities in China. Ostensibly, they're divided into 4 tiers based on factors such as GDP, population size, whether or not they're an important regional hub, what their transport links are, what their educational and job opportunities are like. But there's no definitive list that anyone uses. There are actually quite a few different ones. I think some popular ones are there's one called the Yicai Global List, but I've seen other ones by like China Checkup. I've seen another one by the SCMP. They're all completely different. Some of them divide cities into 4 tiers, some of them do it into 5 tiers, some of them apparently have 18 tiers, some rankings have sub-tiers. So for example, the typical Tier 1 cities are like Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, and Shenzhen, but some people have them as Tier 1 plus. So they're kind of like above other cities that could also be considered like Tier 1, places like Chongqing. Sometimes Shenzhen is in the top and sometimes it isn't. It's all just, it seems arbitrary. I'm sure people have their way of deciding it, but in general, you see the same cities at the top, the same cities are middling, and the majority of cities, like, 200 plus, fall into the bottom rank or so. So how do these rankings actually affect a city's prospects for development? As you might expect, despite the increasingly high cost of living, first-tier cities are still the most attractive destination, particularly for young people. So, for example, one survey of recent graduates found that 64% of them intended to move to a first-tier city, which actually contradicts a more recent report from 2020 that said only 17% of graduates with degrees in China worked in first-tier cities, while the percentage of graduates with a master's degree who work in Tier 1 cities is 33%. Even though 2/3 of people actually want to move to these first-tier cities, the numbers imply that there's some sort of limiting factor. It's probably competitiveness. It's not very clear, again, because there are no government official statistics that we can go off of. But in general, first-tier cities are still seen as places of more opportunity. So in a study that interviewed young people, asking if and why they intend to move to a first-tier city, one respondent answered as follows: "My boyfriend and I are determined to go to a first-tier city because only in these cities can we have greater probability of success. This possibility is fascinating because it can ignite people's spirit of struggle. We may meet some people or come across some opportunities and start business or something like that to fulfill our dreams." So this idea of the ability to fulfill one's dream was really important to a lot of people in this study. And it definitely seems that first-tier cities are more greatly associated with faster career progression, higher earning power, higher quality social networks, and then also kind of receiving sort of approval or admiration from your friends and family. The idea of sort of filial piety, being as competitive and doing as well as possible in school and in life to support your family in the future, or just like, to bring pride onto your family, so to speak, is still a very important concept in China. So unsurprisingly, the more ambitious someone is, the more likely they are to want to move to a first-tier city. But this doesn't mean that low-tier cities are at a complete disadvantage. Especially from a business perspective, it was quite interesting to read that companies can approach the tier list as a sort of prospecting tool. Some might settle to target lower-tiered cities as a better business opportunity. So one business expert put it like this. A manufacturing company may choose to locate themselves in a lower tier city in order to capitalize on lower operational land and labor costs, or may choose a top tier city for the quality of labor and local infrastructure that it has to offer. So essentially, lower tier cities and first tier cities are not really competing on the same grounds. The same article gives an example from a Danish brewing company called Tuborg and what their initial strategy to break into the China market was. Initially, Tuborg was to enter into tier 1 cities, much like its parent company Carlsberg. However, they were ultimately unsuccessful as the market was saturated with too many competitors, including its own partner company. Tuborg eventually went on to relaunch in tier 2 and tier 3 cities, becoming one of the early players in lower tier market. Here, they team up with music festivals and other events to tap into the local culture, allowing Tuborg to play a strategic role within the portfolio. More recent studies have suggested that as housing prices continue to increase and there's more employment competition, people are becoming less satisfied with life in first-tier cities, and there's been a gradual decline in the proportion of graduates trying to even go to them in the first place. But again, it might not be based on decisions made by graduates themselves. And also, I feel like there are a lot of caveats to this sort of generalization. For example, if you're an only child in China who has the responsibility of looking after your elderly parents, who might not have like insurance or pensions or things like that, you're probably less likely to be going to a first tier city because you'll potentially be further away from them. You know, you don't want to be working in a competitive environment all the time. You need to be able to visit and take care of your parents when you need to. Also, if you didn't go to a high ranking university, which is the majority of people, you probably won't even be able to compete in the first place. So going to like a third or even fourth tier city that's new, but maybe has a high proportion of young people and is kind of less competitive, but also has job opportunities, might be the better option. So it's kind of like everywhere, different lifestyles and abilities are suited to different locations. You know, in the UK, for example, you had a lot of people moving out of London, especially during the pandemic. I know a lot of people who want to move to like Midland or northern cities, and I have lots of friends who live either in the north or in Scotland who are very happy with their lifestyles there. So I guess a lower rated city that is more affordable, especially for businesses to set up like new ideas and new businesses. I feel like in London it's so difficult to get on and to create something new from scratch because it is so expensive and so competitive, but you get so much more perspective when you leave London and you see lots of small local shops, and yeah, that kind of vibrance is very cool and very natural as well. Sometimes when you live in a high tier city, so to speak, a lot of life doesn't seem natural and it seems like people are not really grounded. So yes, I empathize. As a former Londoner, I empathize with the people moving to lower tiered Chinese cities. So obviously there's this clear divide between different urban areas in China. Are things like special economic zones actually good things? The tier system, is that so good if it is keeping China's urban centres so fractured? There's a couple of different ways that we can look at this. So according to the functionalist perspective, for example, uneven regional development is an inevitable dimension of the division and specialization of labour in the modern industrial economy. It is argued that this division and specialization of labour assures that the entire population will ultimately benefit from interregional inequalities, which in turn are unavoidable to increase the national wealth. So I think that kind of explanation or summary suits China quite well. It is definitely unequal, again, both on an urban to urban level and a rural to urban level, but I think on an urban to urban level at least, we won't talk about the rural divide just yet, it might be beneficial for people to have options. Like, they're quite clear options and the differences are quite clear, and that's sort of a unique feature of Chinese urban life, and perhaps this is a choice that people would be able to benefit from in Western countries, but we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Something else that I found out about China's urban population that I didn't know before is that only around 65% of the whole population of China live in urban areas, which is still like 920 million people, but compared to other sort of developed countries, this is actually, it makes China rank about the middle of the ranking tables in terms of overall urban population as a percentage of the country's overall population, if that makes sense. And again, it's very concentrated. So the eastern and coastal and southern cities are the largest. Shanghai is the world's 7th largest city, which again, I actually thought it would be higher. And I actually thought that the most populated city would be in China. But Chongqing, which is the third largest city in the world, is actually outranked by Tokyo, which has 39 million people, and Jakarta, which has 34 million people. However, 3 of the top 10 largest cities in the world are Chinese cities, which makes sense. I think they're also the only country that has 2. I think India has 2 cities in the top 10. But yeah, basically, unless your population is over 1 billion people, then you're not going to have that many cities that are breaking 20, 30 million people. It surprised me because it wasn't really what I expected from, especially a country that's poured so much into market economic development in the past 40 or 30 or so years. So considering that China has been the factory of the world for this amount of time, and we know that they have a huge industrial workforce, where do all these people live who are making all of these things, if not in the cities? And so I think that the main answer to that can be found in the Hukou system. So for those of you who don't know, in 1958, China introduced the Regulations on Household Registration, otherwise known as the Hukou system, which assigns each citizen either a rural or an urban citizenship based on their place of birth, their parentage, and their family history. So according to Cindy Fan, the Hukou location specifies where one is entitled to receive benefits. In essence, it defines where one belongs. An agricultural Hukou provides access to farmland. A non-agricultural Hukou provides access to jobs, housing, food, and state-sponsored benefits. Until the 1980s, it was extremely difficult for rural Chinese to survive in the cities because without an urban Hukou, they did not have access to the necessities of life, such as food and housing, many of which were centrally controlled and allocated. The Hukou system therefore kept rural-urban migration to a minimum. So in 1985, the government did actually allow rural residents to obtain temporary residence permits in cities, which, alongside the developing market economy, allowed more rural residents to come to cities to work on a temporary basis. And during the 90s and the noughties and up until now, the Hukou system has been gradually relaxed to allow rural residents to obtain urban Hukous through various means, like holding a steady job in a city for more than 2 years, or graduating from a local university or something like that. There was a very complex chart that described all the different steps that was going around as kind of like a meme. Someone had put it up so that it looked like a snakes and ladders board. So it's like, oh yeah, if you do this, then you can go forward, but take 2 steps back if you don't meet this criteria. If I can find it, I will post it. But yeah, in general, again, even the idea of transferring your rural Hukou to an urban one is based on the individual city selection. So obviously, top tier cities are not going to let anyone just change it. They only want the top graduates, the people with the best work experience, people with more money. So yeah, again, many, many caveats to that policy. So something that's actually occurred as a result of this policy is something that you might be familiar with, something that you might have seen on TV every year. And it's the development of this huge internal migrant community within China that's also kind of known as the floating population. So historically, the majority of these temporary migrants were young men, although increasingly there are a lot more young women, middle-aged people as well, who've been doing this their entire lives. They go to cities looking for jobs in factories or other jobs, service jobs that urbanites don't want to do. They live in dormitories on the same site as their jobs, and basically they do very little except earn enough money to send back to their families. A lot of them are married, and their children tend to live back home in their village with their parents, and they visit once or twice a year, for example, during New Year. And that Chinese New Year period is like the 40-day period that has become known as the largest annual migration in the world. So you probably see that once a year around January, February time. It's always interesting to watch, but it's trust me, it's a nightmare if you're actually there in China and you're trying to do anything during that period. Trying to get a train ticket during that time is just stay at home basically. But the demographic of these migrants is changing. Now they tend to be a bit more better educated. They're not from like typical farming backgrounds, and they're more individualistic. They're not just looking to send money back home, but a lot of them are trying to get that urban Hukou so that they can stay in the city and their children can attend school there. In terms of where these migrants actually fit into society, Yang writes, in China's largest cities, the social and economic segregation of rural migrants, the status hierarchy based on geographic origin, and the segmentation of urban labour market persist. In these cities, most rural migrants occupy the lowest social occupational rungs and are treated as outsiders rather than being assimilated. Under the dualistic Hukou structure, rural Chinese are still excluded from the system of entitlements designed only for urbanites. Rural migrants lack access to retirement, health and unemployment benefits, government-sponsored housing schemes, jobs that prioritize urban residents, and the urban education system. So last year, the government actually announced that the Hukou system is going to be streamlined to encourage more urbanization. So they say that all cities with a population under 3 million will have Hukou limits removed, and registration for an urban Hukou in cities with a population between 3 and 5 million will be eased. They say that this will prevent a mad rush to already large cities, which could overburden their social services. It will encourage even urbanization across China, creating new economic centres, preserve local culture, and prevent Londonization, where all resources get sucked into one metropolis. It allows the central government to focus resources on smaller cities. Again, as a former Londoner, ouch. But yeah, they're not wrong. So some people have expressed doubts as to how far this will help. So this is from an article in The Economist. For most cities, it's relatively easy to lower Hukou barriers because they're not big magnets for migrants. The largest cities are the main destinations. Applicants may still require proof of residency and employment. These are difficult for many migrants to acquire, as they often work without contract and live in places that do not provide rental agreements. On Weibo, commenters have heaped derision on the notion that people would flock to a city in such economic trouble. Some have even questioned why migrants would even want a local Hukou. Many farmers fear that if they abandon their rural homes and farmland, they will lose a fallback option should they fail to make ends meet in the city. They often leave behind elderly family members as caretaker of their land use rights. For young migrants, lack of access to free schooling for their children is a big concern. If they cannot enroll them in state schools, they have little choice but to send them to private ones for migrants that are costly and often shoddy, or else leave their children at home in the countryside. So even though they're trying to revise the urban Hukou system, it's kind of like how they're trying to revise the one-child policy, which is actually another thing that kept the urbanization rates in Chinese cities deflated. But I don't want to talk about that today because, again, the one-child policy could be its own episode. Maybe it will be in the future. But yeah, the Hukou system is one of the reasons why urbanization rates still remain pretty low in China. Relatively low. When we think about China, when we try and conceptualize China, and you bring to mind like the mega cities and the industrial factories and the innovative areas where they're trying to like develop all this tech and science and things like that, it's difficult to reconcile that with the fact that it is still a developing country. It's still very top-down, centrally controlled, even though places like London are very expensive and price a lot of people out. If you're a young person, a young graduate, and you're determined to move to London, you can, and it doesn't really matter where you came from in the UK. You can just go to London, even if you have to share a 3-bedroom house with 5 other people. But yeah, in China, it's not that straightforward. They still want to keep that modicum of control of movement, of freedom of movement over people's lives. So just before we wrap up this episode, I wanted to touch on one final very unique feature of China's urbanization, which you might have heard of referred to as the development of ghost cities. Much like in the Western world, the value of housing as an asset, as opposed to just a place where you live, has taken off as an idea in China as well. Prices have skyrocketed, very much so in recent years. For example, a 2016 survey conducted by China's Economic Daily of 36,000 families across 24 provinces showed that housing assets accounted for 66% of per capita household wealth. So housing is becoming sort of like an investment asset as well, very 2008 of China to do that, very bold indeed. So as the demand for housing as an asset has increased, so obviously has speculation, particularly on the construction side of things, with China's local governments investing huge sums of their own money into urban development, only for whole cities to be left virtually unoccupied. A relatively frequent example I've seen thrown around is the example of Ordos, which is a coal-rich city in Inner Mongolia, well known for its huge but empty skyscrapers, housing and office buildings, particularly in the newly built Kangbashi area. With a population of only 30,000, it's a far cry from the 1 million residents planned for Kangbashi in 2010. Ordos is known as a ghost town, for good reasons. 90% of its buildings are empty. Some have been sold but remain unoccupied, while others are unsold or uncompleted. The Ordos experience is a case of a housing bubble burst. Reports indicate that 70% of construction projects in the downtown area have been halted. Ordos is, however, not a solitary case in China. Several Chinese cities are experiencing similar housing bubbles, a collapse of the real estate market, a spiraling government debt crisis, and a weakening economy due to the slowdown of domestic economy. Scholars are basically arguing that the rise in ghost cities is basically a result of this interregional competition to become, the most important economic and urban center. And this is because of the approach of the central government, which is like, your GDP is the most important thing. So now what local governments are trying to do is use land revenues to increase their GDP. So going back to the previous article, the local government's major source of income for financing infrastructure and social spending is through land transfer revenue. As a result, there was a surge in land allocation for urban construction by 2.5 times between 1990 and 2011, according to the China Statistical Yearbook. Land acquisition is often associated with power abuse, official corruption, and forced eviction and demolition by government and property developers. Ghost cities are the byproducts of Great Leap-style urbanization in China. Their emergence is rooted in China's land-centered urbanization. Rural to urban conversion of land has proceeded much faster than the urbanization of people. If the massive floating population is taken into account, the real urbanization rate could be much lower than the nominal rate indicated by the Chinese authorities. This, of course, is throwing local governments into huge amounts of debt, and it's just one of the many reasons that China's property market is in absolute chaos at the moment, although I won't go into that today because, once again, that is a whole different topic in itself. My undergraduate thesis was actually about protests and rioting in a village called Hukou as a result of corruption due to local governments seizing land illegally and doing shady land transfer deals. And there's also a documentary called Ascension. I think that there's a scene in that, or it's a different documentary. If someone can remember which documentary it is, please comment, let me know, and I can inform everyone. Where basically this guy is in his apartment building. I think there's a few other people in there as well, and they're basically like squatting there and holding out as the last people to prevent the building from being demolished and them being forcibly evicted by the local planning committee. And it's very tense, and they're using scare tactics and things like that, and they've shut off all the water and all the electricity, and he's kind of just living like a guerrilla fighter. It's kind of crazy, actually. So it's a very serious problem in China, and actually a lot of the corruption accusations in China tend to revolve around these sorts of things. So illegal seizure of land by officials from peasants, farmers, or people with rural Hukous who haven't been around and sort of go back home and they're like, why is there a 20-story building on my ancestral land, essentially. So this problem of ghost towns in China is actually something that, funnily enough, the CCP admits to, and they've written many articles about this. But as you can imagine, there's always a bit of a positive spin on it with state-affiliated media in China, which is always, it's nice to read. So there's a very good article in the Global Times, which is one of my favorite outlets. So here's some parts of that article. High-rise apartment blocks, lakes, parks, and long straight roads but no people. These were the typical post-apocalyptic Chinese ghost towns described by some Western media, but they could be the start of new cities and developmental miracles. In a recent example, a subway station of southwest China's Chongqing municipality, which was mocked by CNN in 2017 as being built in the middle of nowhere and with exits hidden among overgrown weeds, has made a fascinating turn. The Caojiawan substation shot to fame again recently after 2 online photos of the station showed how it started and is changing. An exit buried in overgrown weeds in one photo formed a sharp contrast with busy people and wide roads in the same exit. Kangbashi district of Ordos in the Inner Mongolia Autonomous Region, another famous ghost town, widely reported on by many major Western media outlets, has bid farewell to the nickname with its growing GDP, rising housing prices, and long-term development plan. Yang, a local resident of Kangbashi, told the Global Times on Monday that the district's average housing price rose by around 1,500 yuan, or $230, per square meter this year, to around 8,000 yuan. So that's quadrupled? It's very good. And more people from outside Ordos have settled in the city. Our place is not a ghost town anymore. It's now home to 150,000 permanent residents. Per capita GDP reached 173,000 yuan in 2019, compared with just 70,000 yuan nationwide. In 2019, more than 2.8 million tourists visited Kangbashi, filling nearly all the hotel rooms, around 3,500 in the district, during travel season. It's not just Kangbashi. Western media listed several Chinese towns or cities as ghost towns, claiming such developments were largely funded by ballooning debt. It's only a matter of time before it will burst. Cong Yi, a professor at Tianjin University of Finance and Economics, told us that there was a period in second and third tier cities when rapid construction accelerated the development of population and public services, but in the long run, small and medium-sized cities will embrace a balance as overcrowded megacities will drive people to these smaller cities. The process will digest the majority of previously built buildings, although it will take some time. So there you have the CCP's hopeful message for the development of ghost towns in the future. And honestly, I hope they succeed. No one wants to see, an entire city go down and all that infrastructure and sort of effort go to waste. So yeah, good luck to all the ghost cities in China. So that's it really for the history of Chinese urbanization. I would agree with many commentators on the issue that China's version of urbanization is very unique compared to other patterns that we've seen from other developed and developing countries. So one author, Chris Hamnett, wrote in his article, "Is Chinese urbanization unique?" My tentative conclusion is that Chinese urbanization and processes are so different from both Western and other developing country experiences that it's difficult to subsume them. We can certainly look at suburbanization or gentrification or social segregation or any other process and look at the parallels and differences. But the underlying structural differences in terms of the role of the state and the market, the nature of land ownership, the lack of citizen-level input into decisions, and the dominance of the state all point to a very radically different form of urbanization with Chinese characteristics. So that's it for this episode, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. I said it was going to be a brief history, but without editing, I've been recording for like over an hour. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this rambling episode of the podcast. It was very comfy and cozy for me. I'd hope to do more in the future, but obviously I will, if you like the more like topical, exciting, argumentative episodes, I will continue to do both. We'll work in a mix. Why not? But this was a lot of fun. I liked going back into the history side of things again, and I hope you enjoyed it too. Don't forget that Sinobabble also has a newsletter called Sinobabble over on Substack. By the time this episode comes out, I believe I would have just written a book review written by an American author. The subtitle is sort of about how America can win over China. Again, going back to a sort of Zeihan-esque argument, I deliberately sort of aligned those two events to happen roughly at the same time, so that I'm talking about sort of how US-based China watchers view China both as a threat and as something that the US can overcome. So you can head on over to Substack if you want to read that. If